Hi, everybody. Welcome. So this is the meeting, and which is actually required for folks who would like to sit for comps in the subsequent administration, which will be this August. So you're doing that first part. So we're going to have about 20 slides or so to get through, but we're generally going to talk about an overview of the process, start to finish, from the structure, the things that you need to submit, to the structure of the exam, to scoring and grading, and like submission, when you can expect the feedback that you'll receive, kind of all of that, okay? And then we'll have time at the end for questions. If you have a really burning question while we're talking, feel free, but otherwise, for the sake maybe of the recording, we'll just go right into it and then ask the questions at the end, okay? So first thing, in terms of the process overview, attending the mandatory comprehensive exam meeting. You all are here today, so check on that one. We're going to talk about preparation, and that's going to be the second half of today. We'll talk about the submission of the readiness to sit for comprehensive exam form and where you can find that, the actual exam process, and then we'll talk about, after you are done on that Friday, what you do afterwards, proofreading your responses, preparing for the oral defense. We'll talk about the timeline for the oral defense and the timeline for the decision, okay? So hopefully after this will all feel really transparent to you. So in terms of the readiness to sit for comps form, it's here, it's in iCollege. Everybody's familiar with the fact that all of your forms are on iCollege. And if you're not familiar with that, all of your forms are on iCollege. And so it's basically a checklist that says that you've done all the things that we need you to do to sit for comprehensive exams. So you've completed all your required courses, you've done your research courses, and we're going to talk more about that in terms of preparation. One thing that we've noted in the past is an area in which students tend to feel more challenged is in particular the research question. So not having the research preparation, both in terms of coursework and having done your pre-dis, for example, ideally prospectus, or you're close to prospectus, are really, really helpful foundations for sitting for comps. So you'll have completed your pre-dis and have that signed, that form signed, and one of the things that you want to submit is proof that you submitted it for publication. It doesn't have to have been accepted for publication. We understand that that's a whole different standard, but that you've submitted it for publication, okay? And then we also want to make sure that your files are up to date, which many of you, I think most folks in here really did that for APA, so thank you for that. If you haven't, this would be a good time to catch up on those things. And then if you need a waiver for anything, you would submit that as well. So if there's a course that you should have taken or just didn't have time to take because of, we understand that courses aren't offered every single year. There's alternating years. If it just didn't work out in your timetable that you took that class, you would petition to waive that class, and you would just submit that along with this form. You just write a waiver. Yep. You can write a short statement signed by you and your advisor, and then we talk about it as a faculty, and then approve that along with your ability to sit for comps. You'll see that this should be signed by you and your major advisor, and then when I get everything from everybody, I sign it as well, and then this goes into your file. So in terms of the requirements, you all have the most recent handbook, but we're going to go through the critical pieces, okay? So this is as it looks, but I'm going to go through the bullet points. So the first one is the meeting to discuss the process. That's what we're doing now. The readiness form, that needs to be submitted 2 weeks prior to the exam. So the exam will be the dates of August 24th and 25th, which are the first Thursday and Friday after the start of classes. And the classes start, I think, on the 21st or 22nd this year. I checked these dates before this presentation. So 2 weeks before that would be the 10th, which is before classes start, so just note that. You're going to need to submit that. You can submit it as early as you would like, but don't submit it any later than that. So we have time to look over everything. If there's anything that's missing, if there's anything your advisor has questions about, anything like that, we've got a little bit of wiggle room before the actual administration date. Okay, then we're going to talk next about the date and time of administration and submitting responses and the oral defense. Okay, again, this is exactly as it looks in your handbook, so just know that the text is there, but I'm going to break it down right now. Okay, so the seated exam, you will have a room. I will email you before the exam with the exam room. You will be provided with everything that you need. So you just need to come in with we'll talk about exactly what you'll come in with, but you're going to come in and take the exam here on a Thursday and a Friday, okay? So those are August 24th and 25th of 2023. The first day, you're going to sit for your theory question and your research question. You'll have 4 hours for each question. You don't have to use the full 4 hours, but we also wanted to give folks plenty of time to feel like they could submit a well-developed answer, okay, a response. You get an hour break for lunch, 12 to 1. So you'll see here the theory question is administered from 8 to 12. The research question is from 1 to 5, okay? The next day is a half day. You will take the ethics question from 8 to 12. After that, you're going to submit all of your responses. You're going to download your responses onto USBs that you can take with you, and you're going to edit and proofread your response. Now, you'll note in your handbook, it talks about what does this editing look like. What we're saying is it's pretty limited. There's changes to grammar, like you wrote T-H-E-I-R instead of T-H-E-R-E. If you just needed to shift a couple words for clarity. But this should not be a substantive rewrite. And we will compare when you send in your edited draft to your original draft to make sure that you didn't do a substantive rewrite, because that's not what this is. This is an editing for grammar, punctuation, typos, that kind of thing, not for substantive content. You can also edit, in addition to the content of the writing, the other thing we recognize is that's where you're going to add in your citation. So you would have cited people, but you will add in your reference page. Okay? So all of that in APA style, all of that, so that you'll turn that into us the following Monday by noon. So you have the half day of Friday, you have the weekend, noon on the following Monday, which is August 28th. You will submit your full set of responses edited with a reference page. We will then, your committee, and we'll talk about the grading next, but just also know that you're going to have an oral defense that needs to be scheduled within 2 weeks of submission. So you could schedule it 1 week later, a week and a half later, it could be 7, whatever. How you work that out with your advisor, with your committee, is up to you. I would get with your committee earlier rather than later, because there are a number of you and there are a limited number of us. And so many of us will be sitting on many committees. And so I just think that it'll be important to think about scheduling this year. So I put the 2-week deadline. So you all, just so you're in your frame of mind thinking about the timeline, just knowing that you're all going to defend or do your oral defense by September 1st. So the scoring and notification of decision. After you do your oral defense, within 3 days, so you're going to do your oral defense, which is a discussion of your responses. And when we talked about, and I'm going to talk about the scoring process next, but you'll have done your oral defense. Within 3 days, you're going to hear from your major advisor with the decision on your responses. Okay? After that, 2 weeks of your oral defense. Okay, so we'll talk about the scoring process. It's kind of a 2-part process, okay? The first part is just as before, we have pairs of faculty who draft questions. Those same pairs of faculty will review your response. The reason and rationale for that is so that your committee, between the committee and the folks who drafted the response, you're really getting a comprehensive response and review of your question. The other thing is the folks who drafted the question usually have a unique perspective on the response that they were hoping to receive or what they would view as a strong response. Okay, and so these are the folks that do the different questions. So theory is Dr. Davis and I, research is Dr. Rice and it'll be Dr. Saw, and ethics is Drs. Ashby and Turner. Okay, so they'll draft the question, and then they will also review the question and give us feedback. And by us, I mean I'm just representing the DAC committee, okay? So your dissertation advisory committee, who will actually, you'll do your oral defense with that group. They'll offer written feedback, strengths of the response, challenges in the response, things to further query, points of concern, all of those things. The committee will also review your response, and in combination, those will likely be the topics of focus in your oral defense. After that, as I shared, the decision of your committee will be that you pass and fail each of your responses. Now, as your handbook outlines, if you don't pass one question, you will repeat that question at the next administration of the exam. If you do not pass at least two, so if you do not pass two questions or more, you will not pass the entire exam, you fail the exam, and you will retake the entire 3 questions, even if you passed one. Does that make sense? Okay. You'll get your written feedback, as I shared, within 2 weeks. You'll know what the decision is, but we'll give you written feedback, and that could be for a number of reasons. So, it could be that we could see that there are areas that would benefit you in terms of strengthening with regard to a particular methodology or your theoretical orientation or discussion of that would behoove you for your application to internship, for example. You'll note that at least one of the questions when we talk about it, the submission of an APIC essay, we're going to give you feedback. Those are things that will hopefully help you moving forward. Same thing with, for example, the research question. It could be that would be something that would support you if you haven't finished your dissertation, or you're still planning your dissertation or something like that. In terms of things folks are looking for, accurate understanding and application of the concepts relevant to the question. So, for example, the aspects of your theoretical orientation. If you're answering the ethics question, knowledge of ethics codes. Now, one thing, and I've talked about this in seminar, we don't expect you to know, it's blah, 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 3.06. You don't have to know the formal name, but we want you to know the content of the code, right? And you can speak to the ethics code more broadly. Appropriateness and accuracy of your citations and references to support your arguments, consideration of multicultural factors, and clear writing with a minimum of errors.
So what these are is the faculty got together and we're trying to give guidance of what you can expect the question to be, because it is a seated exam. And so, for example, the ethics question is going to be an ethical dilemma, and it will be a question that's relevant to current practice. And in terms of things that we would expect you to review, it's the readings from Dr. Ashby's course. So that's pretty much what Dr. Ashby and Dr. Turner recommended. So for each of these, if y'all want, we can kind of talk about what you're thinking about, because I do think it's important to have a plan for how you're going to study and what kind of things might be helpful, and also kind of how to allocate your time. So I put a few thoughts. These are authorized by nobody. So it's almost to get us started, and after each one, if y'all want, we can kind of pause and see what you're thinking. Y'all can share ideas with each other. But if I were taking this, I mean, one thing that I would do is I would make sure that I found some sort of decision-making model that you like and learn it. It's a seated exam, so it'll be helpful to kind of have a general sense of the steps for that. I think that's one of the things, just as a basic expectation. I think they're wanting to see you use a decision-making model. One of the things that might be helpful if you could get your hands on practice questions for the EPPP or other types of ethical dilemmas is it might help you start to get a sense of when decisions can be tricky. So if you did happen to be able to get a hold of study materials, I think that would help a lot because, you would basically get like a condensed, like the EPPP study guides are about this thick for 2 sections. So there's probably about 50 or 60 pages where it's really condensed information about the ethics code. If I were studying, I'd probably try to find something like that. And then the other thing you can do is, I think we're open to letting people see prior test questions, right? So you would be able to see the question last year for a seated exam, and then you could also look at some of the questions when it was a take-home exam. So, and you can kind of see the difference in the type of question that you would be asked. So any thoughts or questions about the first section? Okay, so the theory question, Dr. DeBlair and I write this question, and there's a little more detail on this one, and it's nice that we're here. We can explain this. Hopefully it makes sense. So what we wanted was we wanted to help you align your work on this question with your APIC application. So to be ready for this question, you need to have a draft of both your theory question and your multicultural question for APIC. And then what we're going to do is we're going to ask you some sort of set of questions, and you can kind of see the questions that we asked Sarah last year, but they're pointed questions where we're asking you to contextualize what you said in your APIC response in a way that would be similar to what you might do when you're interviewing for internship. So for example, we could ask you to give us a case example and illustrate some of the techniques that you would use. Or we could ask you a question of, if your client held a different identity than they do, how would that potentially change how you think about the case? So various ways of contextualizing to what you wrote. You won't be, basically you're going to write your essays, and you can put whatever you want into those essays. So if you want to, give a partial case example, that would be fine. And then we're going to basically ask a question that has you contextualize both your theory and your multicultural statements. So it'll probably be a little easier to see what we mean if you see Sarah's question. But the point is you go into this question with some written content, and you're going to have a chance to respond to some kind of pointed queries. And the types of things we're going to try to ask you are things that we think would prepare you for your interview process. If I was you, I would try to get examples from as many people as you can, just so you can see what they look like. It's pretty straightforward. Yeah, your basic. It's kind of like when you apply to a doc program, like you're responding to an essay question, and you have the freedom to interpret that however you like, but you'll be able to find some guidance of what people are looking for. Like, for example, people do want to see that you understand your theory and that you can kind of concisely describe the key logic, and they usually will want to see that you can give concrete examples of what it looks like for you to do therapy. In terms of the multicultural statement, I think that is often a chance for sites to see some of your values and the language you use to describe your values and what it, I think the type of feedback I got was to be very specific about the experience that I had. Don't just be abstract, but describe specific things that I had done and specific experiences I had had on practicum that demonstrated my growing competence. So the thing that's worth saying is you can get as much feedback on those as you want before the exam. So it would kind of be silly not to go into the exam with feedback from your doctoral advisor. So you should be ready, and that should be in pretty good shape by the time you sit for the exam. So other thoughts, look at your readings from the first year course and Dr. Ashby's advanced theory course. Anything that Dr. Turner went over in practicum would be good to review. Make sure you have a good sense of the evidence base for your theory. So a lot of times people will ask about that, as well as limitations in the generalizability of your theory. So if your theory may not work as well with certain populations, it would be important for you to be aware of that. And other than that, ask people about questions that they got, when they're interviewing for internship, because those are the types of questions that we'll probably want to ask. Okay, so the research question, this, similar to both the other questions, we tried to standardize the type of question you're going to get. So the starting point is you're going to read an article, and it probably won't be from like Journal of Counseling Psychology. It will probably be an article that's published in a second-tier outlet, and it will have problems. And so your job initially will be something like what it is when you review an article. You're going to be asked to critique the article, and you can identify strengths, of course, but one of the main skills is you'll want to be able to identify the primary weaknesses of the study. So this, the outline points are just giving you language to think of, almost like a checklist of the different things that could be limitations of the study. So issues related to validity and the various types of validity, issues related to the method section of the paper, and especially sampling issues, measurement problems, and also things about the things about the research design that could have implications for causal inference, and then also considerations related to diversity and potentially ethics or external validity of the findings. And then the last thing that you'll be asked to do is you'll be asked to pick some critique, probably a major one, and say what you would do to address that issue in a new study. So my understanding is you're going to have these sections. So you'll read the article and you'll be asked to cover these 4 areas. So you don't really have to worry about what the format of the question is. The main thing to do in preparation is to educate yourself to the standards of counseling psychology. And I think the best articulation of that is a combination of the courses that you took in the department from Dr. Rice and Dr. Dispenza, as well as the work that you've done with your advisor. So submitting manuscripts, getting feedback on manuscripts, and a lot of the kinds of mistakes that people make on the research question, they really are just detail things that you likely would get feedback if you're doing research regularly and submitting articles and getting feedback from reviewers. So one of the things that you can do to prepare is do research and get lots of feedback on your work. I'd have some warning if you haven't gotten a lot of feedback on your writing. That's probably one of the things that gets people into trouble when they sit for this question, because it's one thing to kind of know something conceptually, but it's kind of another thing altogether to apply it. And so, but Dr. Rice and Dr. Saul did give a list of suggested readings. So the Wampold text, so he gave you a textbook, 3 chapters of Shadish, which I imagine was assigned readings in the quant course. And then you can practice selecting articles from second-tier outlets and thinking about what would it take to get this published in a higher-tier outlet. And you could talk with your advisor about that. You could read introduction and discussion sections of top papers, because they're going to basically be laying out logic, critiquing prior work. And so you can try to kind of acculturate yourself to the types of critique in counseling psych literatures that you might be able to use to critique a article that's kind of a second-tier publication. And then read method and results sections in research articles. So, I mean, reading, if you don't have time to publish 10 papers, that would be the best thing to do. But if you don't have time to do that, what I would do is read a lot. And I would read a lot in top outlets, because when someone writes a good paper, one of the things that they do is they explain each step of what they do and why they do it, and that's the part that you actually need to know. And in particular, the method section, so the participants, what people are describing there, and understanding the logic of why they're making certain decisions with the sample and what makes certain sampling procedures better. The measurement section of the paper, having a general understanding of scale development and what kind of problems you might be able to identify. Like, seriously, if you're reading an article and there's really bad measures and you know that language and you know how to critique that, that's a pretty strong critique. I mean, you can basically say, we can't trust the study much at all because the primary outcome measure is terrible, and so what do we know? So if you're pretty comfortable with measurement critiques, think about like measurement and invariance issues, all the things that you learned in Dr. Rice's course. And then the other thing that you might want to beef up on is understanding issues related to correlation versus causality. And so if in an article someone is claiming, causal direction, but their data doesn't support that, slam them, So, I mean, that's really what you're kind of trying to learn is, where is it that someone they think that they have a really nice set of findings, but if you kick the tires and you look at it, we actually can't trust what they're saying because there are significant flaws in the study. So one of the things that you're wanting to be able to demonstrate is that you can recognize significant issues. So if you miss, like a minor issue, like, say you you don't catch that maybe there should have been a Bonferroni correction or something like that, that's actually probably not going to result in you not passing the question. You might get queried and say, well, did you notice this? And, you'd be, oh, well, of course I'd do a modified Bonferroni correction. So you'll actually have a chance to respond to queries. But I would say the thing I would really focus on is make sure that you can show Dr. Rice and Dr. Saul, and also your committee, that you understand what the big ticket items are. So if there's a sample of 46 people and someone ran like an exploratory factor analysis, that's horrible, right? Like, those are the kind of things that you don't want to let kind of really big deal issues kind of slip by you. And so I think the best way to practice this is to practice it. Like, find some articles, review them with each other. You could probably do like one or two a month between now and comps as a group, and then maybe once or twice after y'all have kind of looked at it. Ask your advisor to kind of look at the same article and see what you may have missed. That's the kind of practice that I think would prepare you for this. And then the second part is, how do you fix it? That part's probably the trickiest. And so I do have a few suggestions. So we've already talked about familiarize yourself with the publishing standards of JCP. I think if you're in a position to do so, just getting a draft of your prospectus done would help. Because, like I said, the more feedback you get on your writing and making decisions, that will actually help you. So, for example, if one of the things that you say is a flaw is, that they didn't do measurement and variance testing, and that's actually what you did in your dissertation, that's going to be a lot easier to justify than if you've never written about that before. And then the last thing I'll say is, when I've seen people get into the most trouble with comps, like I've been here, I think this is 12 years now, it's almost always that they tried to do something that they know a little bit about, and it's the right idea, but it's just kind of outpunting your coverage. So if I've never used growth mixture modeling, comps is not a good time to try to, explain that. Dr. Rice probably knows most of the analyses you would say you want to do. So it's going to be obvious very quickly if you're saying that you would do something that you actually don't know how to do. It would be much better for you to pick an analysis, regression, repeated measures ANOVA, pick something that you know pretty well and you may have even executed, because you'll be able to talk about, here's the analysis, here are the steps, here are the assumptions that I would need to test. Those are the kind of things that you're likely to be queried about. And you're almost certainly going to get queried about issues related to power. So pick something that this is a good time to just kind of aim moderate. You don't get bonus points for trying something really, really difficult. I'm almost thinking about it when you watch the Olympics and someone, you've got the gold medal. All you got to do is land one jump. Are you going to do your most difficult routine, or are you going to do just one that you can do in your sleep? Because all you have to do is land it and not fall, and you got the gold medal. That's pretty much the research question. I spent a little more time on that one because really this is the one that's harder. It's harder. It's a hard one to kind of cram for, to be honest. This exam is designed to be taken at the end of your training, and so I think the research question is the hardest one to kind of cram for or take early. I think all of the other ones, if any of y'all are kind of thinking about should I wait to take it or should I take it early, I think the research question is the one that's the trickiest.
So just a couple of additional thoughts. Having done this here and at a couple of institutions now, things that I think are just good reminders, because your anxiety is going to ramp up. It's probably higher now than it was earlier. Maybe not for all of you, but maybe for some of you, or it will be later. But one is sometimes, and you're actually a larger group, so if all of you are sitting for comps and you're talking about it, it's really easy for you to hear Chunyi has an entire binder or a Dropbox folder of color-coded topics organized by year. Oh my goodness, I didn't do that. This is terrible. And I remember when I studied for comps, one of my good friends literally had this huge binder, because I'm older, and she had it color-coded and and I just am not like that. And so I spent a lot of time making a color-coded binder, even though I am not a color-coded binder person. I wasted hours of my study time because I thought that's the right way to do it. And what would have been helpful, and what my own advisor reminded me of, is, Carleen, you got to this point knowing what your way of working is. Just trust your way of working. You know what your style is, you know what works best for you, you know how you study best, you know what's effective for you, and it might not be the same as the person who's sitting next to you, and that's perfectly okay. So trust your process. You know yourself, you know what works. It doesn't have to look like another person in the group and how they're doing it. Develop a study schedule. Now you have a sense of what these questions are going to be. Where do you see your most growth? Or what's going to be most challenging for you? What are you going to need to lay out more time for starting today? Make that schedule and then stick to that schedule. Now, I'm not saying be rigid, like if you don't make it, whatever, like 1 or 2 days off, but this is not something to cram for. So this isn't something like July, 20th or something. I'm like, oh, crud, I got to take an exam. And I'm like, that's not. This is look at your summer, look at the questions, look at your areas of growth, look at the areas of strength because you all have them. So I think this is one where this is already really helpful. I think I could, this one might be an area that I already feel pretty good about. You all did some prep. The other thing is, you can work on your essays. That might be something that you knock out earlier and then you start to get feedback on, but come up with a timeline based on what works best for you. Think of the schedule. And then think about stress management. So the next several months are going to be stressful. What is your plan? And the contagion effect is real. So one thing that can happen is I get really anxious and I in my revved up hyper hamster way talk about my anxiety to another person, and now they're revved up and now we're both together really revved up and only getting more and more high pitched and anxious in our experience. Try to think about, okay, what are the ways that I'm going to deal with my own anxiety, and how am I going to both be supportive of my colleagues and not necessarily take on additional anxiety and have my anxiety amplified by their anxiety. Because that's another thing. We know it's harder. Anxiety gets in the way of retaining and encoding information. You all know that as psychologists in training and counselors, right? So that's not, so think about how are you going to manage your stress? How are you going to both stay connected with the folks you're going to work with, if you're going to do studying together or not? How to do that without amplifying the anxiety and getting to a place where it's just I can't even do this, this is impossible, whatever the negative self-talk might end up being. So just do some inoculation now. What's my process? How am I going to manage my stress? And how am I going to manage my stress in the context of potentially a lot of people around me being very stressed? Typically, and even in this, part of the reason, to be honest, that we did it in a more truncated timeline was because, folks when we were doing a take-home exam, it was, feasibly several months of engaging in this process. So yes, in the past, what folks have done is for the days of the exam, or even when it was writing and they had a couple of weeks, letting sites know this is my comps exam day. I have 2 sit-down full days of exams. I won't be able to come in for those dates. Yeah. So you should be, we should be preparing for your oral exam. So now you've turned in your exam. You fixed some typos, you did some stuff, but let's say, and again, your question doesn't have to be perfect. It couldn't have possibly been perfect. We gave you half day, a 4-hour time period to write a response to an answer that has a lot of possible responses. So it doesn't have to be perfect. What it needs to show is that you thoughtfully engage the question and you're pulling from a repertoire of training that suggests that you should be a doctoral candidate, right? So you turn in your question. Maybe give yourself a little bit of time. I'd give yourself a day or two, right? Just give yourself a little bit of space, and then come back to your questions and your responses with a fresh perspective. This would be a good time to get really critical about your responses, right? Where could I have been stronger based on what I know now with all that I have access to? Because now I have access to all my articles. I have access to, the books. I have access to the primary resources of my theoretical orientation. Oh, I could have spoken more clearly about this. Anticipate what you think the readers potentially would have critiques of your question, what those critiques might be, and start to make notes and start to supplement what you have. So prepare. So the oral is not something to not prepare for and just be like, well, I'm just going to come in and talk about my question. No, it's a build on of your question. So they are combined. And by that I mean, let's say you're up to this point, your response is like, oh, we're like, wow, this is really strong. This is, really, we're really impressed by your grasp of like validity. And then we just ask you a question. So, you did a nice job talking about this aspect of the study. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you contrasted that with some weaknesses in the internal validity? And you go off the rails, that is a lower score, but it's a combination. So it's also an opportunity if in your written response, we'll note some things that were less clear and you're able to say, oh yeah, no, I know, due to time and just kind of whatever, I didn't actually address all those points. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to do that today. These are the things that I would add to my response. Great. You just brought your, average response up to a glowing response. So it's a combination, and so it's not like you turn in your written response and your grade is determined. Far from it. It truly is a combination, and that's also a professional development thing. You're going to go into, as a professional, you're going to go in a lot of circumstances. Sure, there's a content piece, but you're going to be able, how well are you able to communicate your ideas? How well are you able to further explicate your ideas? How well, when someone is confused by something that you convey, how well are you able to clarify your point, right? All those things. So in those 2 weeks or in that period of time when you submit, do additional reading. Take a critical lens to all of your responses and think about where, if I had more time, or if I had this is where I would have strengthened that. Oh, this actually could have been clearer. Oh, I had a decision-making model for ethics, but I mentioned it in the beginning and then I never talked about it again. I probably could have structured my question this way. And, so there's a lot of opportunity to build and expand and enhance your response. So take the opportunity and come in ready to, even if you don't get the question, that's okay. Like even if somebody doesn't ask you about this aspect of your theoretical response, you could say, I really appreciate that question. You answer the question, you go, and actually in rethinking and reevaluating my response, I really wish I would have also included this. There's still an opportunity to have that conversation with your committee. Yeah, so that's a part of this is engaging the primary reading. So you should have citations for your theories question, for your ethics question. I mean, ethics is a little more straightforward. There's probably a citation for your decision-making model. There's the APA guidelines for ethics. There's not a ton. There's probably, the other thing to think about with your ethics is that there are also principles and guidelines for practice with particular populations. It's not like you need to know, the exact perfect, but you could probably be citing those as well. I feel like ethics, I think, Donnie, tell me if you agree, but I think ethics is a little bit more straightforward. You're going to pull a lot from ethical guidelines and potentially, principles for practice. And then if there were texts that Dr. Ashby or Dr. Turner recommended or utilized, I think that would be good. But for your theories, you're going to want to know the primary resources for your theory. And similar to what we talked about, if you have critiques, articles that critique your theory, particularly with regard to, for example, multicultural considerations, maybe methodology, you want to think about things like evidence-based practice, and so, kind of some of those things. Yeah.